Okay. Yep. How important was Vietnam to the Kennedy administration?
Well, Vietnam, really more accurately Laos, was almost, after Berlin, the top problem at the beginning of the Kennedy administration in '61, foreign problem. And then after the Laos agreements of '62 and the new efforts that were made in South Vietnam, it became quite a lot less important in terms of urgency, at least. But after turmoil began in Saigon in '63, summer of '63, it becomes more important than ever to President Kennedy, and it may have been the thing that he had to work on the hardest in the foreign field, accepting the test ban, in the last months of his life.
How would you assess the U.S. responsibility for the Diem coup and the assassination of Diem and his brother, and how did it change and deepen, how did the coup and the assassination change or deepen the American commitment to Vietnam?
The Kennedy administration gave up hope about the Diem brothers, at least if the two of them were to, Diem and New, his brother, at least if the two of them were to remain in power somewhere in the summer and early fall of '63, and it's hard to be precise about that, even now, I think, and was responsible, certainly, for permitting, agreeing in the very strong conclusion of Ambassador Lodge that we ought not stand in the way of a change of government and should let that be known. And certainly that position had a great deal to do with the fact that a coup occurred. The assassination of Diem and New came as a great shock to the president, and I think he greatly regretted that stronger action had not been taken to make clear in advance that that was certainly no part of any American desire or intention. There's an interesting question whether the assassination or the coup or the combination and the element of American encouragement in that deepened the American commitment. I don't think that it had that effect in President Kennedy's own mind, or would have had that effect, so far as I can guess, on his decisions if he had lived.
How did Lyndon Johnson perceive his inheritance from the Kennedy administration? Could you describe his meeting with Henry Cabot Lodge on the 24th of November, 2 days after President Kennedy was assassinated? And also, what was President Johnson's attitude towards the coup? What did he feel about the Diem coup?
My first knowledge of Lyndon Johnson's views as president on Vietnam came, I think, about a couple of days after the assassination. Ambassador Lodge came back right after the assassination. The president was very eager to see him, and a meeting was arranged. The president wanted that meeting, it seemed to me, from the way he conducted it, mainly for the purpose of making it very clear that he thought it was of very high importance to maintain a very firm position in support of South Vietnam, that he himself was most unenthusiastic about the coup, that he wanted to convey to Ambassador Lodge this sense of determination, and in a way his view that greater determination if anything, would be the hallmark of the new administration, and that in particular he was not of the view that we should be unnecessarily picky and choosy about anyone who showed real capacity to govern in Saigon.
And yet, would you say that there was during 1964, there was a kind of caution on Lyndon Johnson's part about becoming involved in Vietnam, a hesitation as he went in? At that stage, did you think he began to look at Vietnam as a major challenge, or did that arrive later?
I think it is right to think of Lyndon Johnson as having treated Vietnam with the whole Vietnam issue with great care and wariness in 1964, really for two reasons. One was the great uncertainty and lack of clarity in the political situation in Vietnam, and the other was that he was not at all eager to have to make large decisions, perhaps with military elements in them, during an American election year. At the same time, he was aware of the painful fact that the information from Vietnam, from all sources, showed a situation that was getting worse and worse from the point of view of the long-term survival of a non-communist society in South Vietnam.
Did you consider that the sending of Maxwell Taylor and General Westmoreland to Vietnam, did that represent a form of escalation? Were we sending in the first team now?
I think that when the President sent General Taylor to replace Ambassador Lodge and General Westmoreland to relieve General Harkins, he was consciously trying to send the ablest individuals he could find for the two senior positions in Saigon, and I don't think I would call that escalation. I would call it simply recognition that the Vietnamese hotspot was now the place where you most needed the best people you could find.
Now, in June of 1964, Johnson authorizes contingency plans for bombing the North. Was there pressure from the military for these plans, or were they routine contingency plans?
There's nearly always a process of wanting contingency plans made in the military. I think there was some sense of increasing urgency in the certainly among the chiefs and the Joint Staff, quite understandably because of the deteriorating situation in straight military terms as they saw it in Vietnam. The President's authorization of contingency planning was certainly not, in his view, a preliminary decision to go ahead with whatever plan emerged, or any kind of authorization of expectations that he would. Presidents, and Lyndon Johnson was certainly no exception on this point, very rapidly learned the difference between a contingency plan and an authorized act.
Let's go on to the Tonkin Gulf resolution. Could you describe how the resolution, which later became the Tonkin Gulf resolution, was first conceived, and what its evolution was? And why did President Johnson feel he needed a resolution?
Two of those separate questions. Don't load it up.
Ask it again, then, would you?
Could you describe how the resolution that later became the Tonkin Gulf resolution was initially conceived, and how it was drafted and eventually became the Tonkin Gulf resolution?
Well, it was already very clear in 1964 that if you...
Okay. Speaking of the a resolution that would later become the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. How was it first conceived and drafted, and what was its evolution during the spring and summer of 1964?
Well, it was obvious that the situation in Vietnam was far from stable in '64, and that if in fact the United States was going to carry out its declared intent to do its best to prevent a communist overrun of South Vietnam, there would be at least hard choices to make, and there might be a choice for stronger action. By that time, there was a pretty well-established tradition of supporting congressional action, seeking supporting congressional action, and usually, in fact, getting it in cases that might require that kind of use of force. That happened in the Middle East resolution and in resolutions about Cuba. And so it was really quite natural that people watching this unfolding situation should begin to think that it might be important to go for a resolution of support from the Congress for a position of readiness to take further actions.
Was the Tonkin, when it became the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, was it in fact a resolution in search of an incident, or as you said, was this just a normal planning operation?
I think it was a normal planning operation. The choice that the resolution would be put forward in the context of Tonkin Gulf was a very presidential choice. I remember learning about it from President Johnson, and in that same conversation, when I raised questions about whether we were sure that we wanted to ask for this rather broad resolution in the context of these quite specific events, the President made it clear that he had already made his decision and was determined to present the resolution for action. I formed the impression that he had consulted on the Hill and found that there would be support for the resolution, and in his view, tactically, this was a good time to put it forward.
Looking ahead, and the way the President used the resolution later as kind of a blank check that he kept pulling out of his pocket, could you comment on that? Do you think it became a rather tattered piece of paper after a while?
The President proved to be entirely right, of course, about whether there would be public support and congressional support for the resolution, which the administration called the Southeast Asia Resolution, but which has become generally known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution at the time. And it served the purpose of August 1964, I think very clearly, to show that an attack upon American vessels on the high seas, whatever the surrounding or mitigating circumstances, would call for reaction, and that reaction would have widespread support, and that further action might be taken, not specified, terms and conditions not stated. I don't think myself that that's the important set of questions about the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. I think the important questions arise from its use as a general justification for whatever later decisions the President might make. I think, in other words, that it's not the Southeast Asia Resolution that is primarily at issue, but the fact that a resolution passed in one context became used as was used as a general justification for very much larger actions in a way that was, I think, almost bound to give pain unless the action could be short and easy and successful. And, of course, the larger involvement of the United States was none of those things.
Let me just touch on the Tonkin Gulf incident itself. The communists are now saying that the Maddox was in their territorial waters and that there was only one incident. What, in fact, from your information, what happened?
I think the Tonkin Gulf episodes, both of them, did in fact occur, and did occur on the high seas. The initial observation or contact may have occurred inside a 12-mile area, although certainly always outside a 3-mile area. The government of Hanoi had never made a formal change in its territorial limits, as I understand it, which were 3 miles in the days of the French. They later made a formal assertion of a 12-mile claim, but had not done so at the time of the episode. Again, I don't think myself that the exact area or the exact technical status of the ships is the most important point. The most important and really genuinely surprising fact was that North Vietnamese torpedo boats pursued an American destroyer to a point more than 20 miles offshore and made an attack on such an American vessel. That was very surprising to us.
But could you touch on the possibility that Hanoi might have thought that the Maddox and Turner Joy were supporting the South Vietnamese covert operations being run against those coastal towns?
There has, of course, been argument over whether the South Vietnamese could have reached the conclusion that the American destroyer or destroyers...
Sorry, it was a North Vietnamese.
Excuse me. There has, of course, been argument over the question whether the North Vietnamese could have supposed that Maddox and Turner Joy were participating in South Vietnamese raids that certainly had some American knowledge and covert support. I'm inclined to the view that that's not likely, but it's not impossible. It would still not make it less surprising that they would pursue and attack on the high seas. The strong and widespread feeling, I think, in the government was that the attack of August 2nd and the night attack of August 4th, which the government did believe happened, and I believe happened, showed a level of aggressiveness that was surprising.
But Lyndon Johnson at the time used the phrase unprovoked aggression. In retrospect, do you think that was a fair phrase?
Well, I don't think I want to second-guess all the language that Lyndon Johnson used while he was president.
Let's go on to these incidents, the Bien Hoa airfield incident and the Brinks incident. Did you go back and recall the situation at the time, this is the end of '64, when there was a plan for bombing, that descents could have gone forward at these particular instances? Why didn't they take place at the time that they did?
As I recall, the problem of whether or not to reply to specific attacks on American installations in South Vietnam perhaps by air action against the North. It was very much a question that was being pushed forward for decision. There were people who thought it urgent to reply to these attacks and others who were more cautious, and the president had naturally kept the decision in his own hands. I think that there were two episodes toward the end of 1964 where I think he decided not to take action for essentially special reasons. One of them was an attack that occurred just before the election, an action taken right on the eve of election might have magnified effect one way or another that made it an inappropriate moment for a serious choice. And another one occurred just at Christmas Eve, as I recollected, and again, there are all sorts of reasons for not using force near Christmas.
Well, this takes us up to Pleiku and your visit to Vietnam in early February. Could you describe, as having gone through that particular incident, and what actually happened, and what was your reaction, your mood, as you went through and experienced it?
Well, the attack on the Pleiku airfield and installation occurred.
Stand up. Please take these questions separately. I mean, I just want to hang on.
Okay. Why was the why was the bombing postponed, or not? Why didn't it take place when the communists attacked the airfield of Bien Hoa?
The Bien Hoa attack brought strong recommendations from the field that there should be some kind of reply. That attack occurred just before the election, and although I don't recall hearing the president explain his decision not to act in terms of the election, I feel quite confident that he would have thought that taking an action as large as this, in terms of its public impact on the eve of the election, would be a mistake.
And how about the trigger when the Brinks bachelor officer quarters was attacked?
The Brinks attack came just before Christmas, and again, without the president saying so, at least to me in so many words, I don't think it's hard to believe that he would have thought that Christmas was not a good time for a decision of this sort.
Now, before you went to Vietnam, in early February 1965, how did you view the situation even before you went? Did you believe there was a need to escalate the war, or what was your feeling at that stage?
1964 had been a bad year in terms of the progress and lack of progress made in South Vietnam by non-communist, anti-communist forces. And as the election smoke cleared away and the president got ready to address the things on his agenda for 1965, it seemed to me that it was important to bring to his attention that the situation in Vietnam was almost sure to require hard choices in 1965. Either the United States would decide to do quite a lot more without my knowing or being prepared to give any view with any confidence as to what that more would be, or we could expect the non-communist society to be overrun.
Now, you went out there in early February. What was your experience? The Pleiku incident took place.
I went there to Saigon with a whole team of people representing the agencies principally interested. And while we were there, the attack on the Pleiku airfield installation occurred. And we were in Saigon at the time, and naturally there was an immediate gathering of both the visiting team and the ambassador and the commander at military headquarters, as I recollected, and we found our friends in Washington on the wire, and they wanted our recommendation. Took us a little while to concert a view, which was that this episode did call for a reply. I formed the strong impression that that was very clearly the sentiment at the other end of the wire. As I recollect it, I was talking principally with Cy Vance, who was then the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And I was talking not just for myself, but for everyone in that Saigon headquarters, and he was asking on behalf of the National Security Council, in the end on behalf of the President. We gave him a recommendation, which, as I understood it, was the one that they were quite independently, strongly moving toward. And then they decided, or there were decisions on military channels as to just exactly which targets would be struck. I don't recall having any part in that.
Had you visited wounded in the hospital, and do you, looking back, do you feel that your recommendation, that there was a certain amount of emotion in your recommendation that moves under Johnson?
That's one of the things that's in a lot of books, and it's a lot of nonsense, because we didn't go to the hospital until afterwards, and I really don't think a question and answer on that tells very much, unless you really want it.
When you got back to
we went up, and what happened was that Westy went up to look at the hospital, and I went to look at Pleiku, and then we visited a field hospital, or the nearest hospital, on the way back. But I don't think that had anything to do with our recommendation, because our, recommendation for immediate reply had already been made, so no way of doing that.
When you got back to Washington, you told the President that, I'm quoting, the very best the struggle in Vietnam would be long, and you advised that this be made to both Americans and Vietnamese. What did you feel at this stage? You haven't told this to the President. And do you recall what his reaction was? And is this a point at which you felt that he should have come forward to explain to the public what the costs of all of it would be?
Now, this is one where you've asked me a question. It's very hard to respond without taking it as a question. I know quite how to do this.
All right, let's go back and could you reconstruct your conversation with the President?
Well, you would like me to comment to the question of my view that at best it would be long, and I communicated that to the President, and what about his view? One of the things that was quite apparent from our visit to Saigon and discussions with people who were closer to the situation than we in Washington had been was that at the very best this was going to be a long struggle. And in the report that I made to the President when I got back, I made that point, and I think I tried to underline the further point that it would be very important to make it clear, both in South Vietnam and to the American public, that this would be a long, hard business at best. And if you look line by line at what the President said in 1965, you will, I think, find that he said that, and said it more than once. Certainly said it in his Baltimore speech. But if you ask the wider and deeper and in a way more important question, whether he used the pulpit of the presidency to drive that point home in that year, I would have to say I don't think he did, and I think it was a mistake. I thought so at the time, and it was one of the points on which he simply didn't agree with me.
Given the experience of bombing during the Second World War, did you believe that bombing the North could be decisive? What did you think it could accomplish?
My own view of bombing of the North was, in a sense, never the majority view. I believed in a policy of what I think we then called sustained reprisal, in which the level of bombing would be quite explicitly related to the level of communist activity in the South. A particular motive that seemed important to me was that we were in a position, as we had been for a long time, of believing, at least I believed, that the decisive variable in this contest was the level of effort and of self-defense that could be mounted by the South Vietnamese. That their effort and our effort to spur them on might be and could be strengthened if they were to understand that we were not saying that their ultimate opponent, which was, I believe then and now, the government in Hanoi, was operating from a totally protected sanctuary. That attacks against the North in shorthand would both strengthen morale in the South and strengthen our case for pressing for greater effort by the South.
Now, in the spring of 1964, we send Marines to Da Nang. We put the 173rd Airborne in Bien Hoa, essentially to defend the air bases, and this is part of the bombing of the North. At that stage, did you see it in those terms, or did you see it at that time?
We have 10 feet left, so we have 10 feet left, so.
Okay. Go ahead, just pick it up.
The bombing of, as it stood in 1965, was recommended by different people for different reasons. My own reason for supporting it was that it did seem to me that it would certainly have some effect on North Vietnamese, and that we ought to be able in some measure to interrupt their supply lines. But the more immediate reason was that one of the real blocks to an improvement in South Vietnamese morale and performance that we thought we saw there in our February visit was the very strong feeling that it was wrong and unfair and unjust and a sign of American lack of will and determination that there should be no action taken against the primary source of the troubles of the South Vietnamese government, namely the government in Hanoi. So it was for immediate morale reasons and also to give a feeling that there would not be any such general immunity to the people in Hanoi that I supported the bombing in February.
Do you think bombing worked?
Well, in a measure, that it would have been worse without it, I do think. But of course it created a major international political problem, in part because of the difficulties of doing it precisely and the difficulties of explaining it. But it was one element in a course of action taken in 1965, which certainly prevented early defeat.
When the Marines went into Da Nang and the 173rd Airborne went to Bien Hoa, did you see that as part of the bombing operation, or did you see that as the beginning of a combat troop build-up?
I don't think I focused sharply on the question whether reinforcement or introduction of the first combat units for the immediate purpose of protecting airfields was only that or was an inevitable first stage in large-scale combat deployments, I think I accepted the judgment that they were needed to protect the airfields and that decisions on their wider use could be made as events unfolded.
Now, the decisions actually to move into, to commit additional combat troops were made in July, and there's meetings in July. I wonder if you could describe that meeting and focusing on one particular point as to whether the decisions were made at those meetings or were the decisions made beforehand and merely ratified.
The most important decisions of 1965 were those that were worked out over a period of several weeks in June and July of 1965 and announced by the President toward the end of July. Decisions which led to, as I think he put it, a planned level of deployment of some 150,000-75,000 and a strong prospect, which he stated, that more would be sent later. Now, those decisions are obviously presidential. And exactly when President Johnson reached his own firm conclusion that he would endorse that level of deployment, I don't believe anybody but Lyndon Johnson will ever know. My own impression is that he was reasonably certain in his own mind that he would take this course at the time when he sent Secretary McNamara to meet with Taylor and Westmoreland and to see if he could bring back a concerted and agreed recommendation, which indeed the Secretary of Defense did. I think the President would, at that point, have strongly expected to approve in the main. Now, let me get those dates right and we can put them in.
And McNamara's come back to Vietnam. Had the decision been made to make the additional commitment before that week-long series of meetings took place and the President announced it on July 28th. And incidentally, I wanted to remind you that he makes that announcement at midday.
You want me to say a comment on that?
Please.
In the same answer?
Well, it's part of it.
It's really part of the question of how do you reinforce the public support of the Southeast Asia resolution. It ought to be another question, I think. I think it's important.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead on what?
The biggest decisions of 1965 are made during the course of June and July, and they are large-scale troop deployment decisions, eventually announced by the President on 28th of July in a rather interesting way. As to when the President really decided that that was what he was going to do, you can get a lot of argument, but my own feeling is that he had pretty much made up his mind that major ground force reinforcements were going to be necessary to avoid real defeat in the South, which he was pledged to avoid. And that when he sent Secretary McNamara to talk with Taylor and Westmoreland in the middle of July, he was already pretty well clear in his own mind that he would support any agreed recommendation of about the level that was finally announced. When McNamara didn't bring back a renewed or an agreed recommendation, there was extended discussion, and all the pros and cons were very carefully reviewed, but I myself think that the President's sense of his own main direction was already pretty clear in his head, and that he was simply testing for additional arguments that he might not have thought of, and confirming a judgment in his own mind that he had pretty well worked out. The only major change that he made in the recommendations McNamara brought back was that he decided against a reserve call-up.
Now, as you observe the president, during those meetings, do you recall his mood? I mean, was he very gung-ho, or was he getting involved regretfully or reluctantly?
I think he was very serious. There was nothing enjoyable about having to take these larger actions, which he had put off for all sorts of reasons. Yet I think also he was internally working out the basic argument, testing his own judgment once more, and I think the records of those meetings, as one looks back on them, show that it was rather more than just an exercise in theatricals. It was a retesting of a very large decision, which nonetheless I think was already pretty well settled in his own mind.
And yet, his announcement on July 28th is done in a very low-key manner.
The question of making the decision and the question of announcing it and ensuring effective national support for it are really two different things. The president made the announcement perfectly clearly that there would be 75,000 troops. I don't remember the exact numbers, and that more would be sent later. There was no secret about it. But he didn't make the announcement, as I had always assumed he would, in a message delivered to the Congress. He took almost the lowest key method of making an announcement, short of putting it in a written message. He had a press conference in the middle of the day, which is, as even I know, not the choice you make if you are looking for the largest possible public impact. I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the president wanted as low-keyed an announcement as he could get, and as little energetic public debate as possible.
Could you be a little more precise on why the decision was made to send the additional combat troops? Could you describe what was in fact happening to the South Vietnamese forces?
I think the...
we got to change it.
Oh. You've got rather a short view.
Go ahead. I'm referring to the Johns Hopkins speech in unconditional discussions. What did unconditional discussions mean? And do you think that if the communists had accepted that, the continuing commitment of additional troops would have gone on?
The phrase unconditional discussions was the president's own choice as to what he would say about the process of communication or negotiation in the Johns Hopkins speech early on in April. It was, of course, not accepted, and a very interesting question does arise as to what the administration would have done, the Americans would have done, if there had been an agreement of some sort to talk between Hanoi and Washington. I don't think it's easy to say just how President Johnson would have handled that situation. I think he would have intended that they should be genuinely unconditional and that they should not interrupt any of the actions which, in his view, became necessary later in the spring and early in the summer, unless, indeed, the level of action by the North Vietnamese had gone down so that those actions could be not taken or put off, so that we'll always have to guess what would have happened if that offer or invitation had not been peremptorily rejected.
How did you evaluate George Ball's memo, which opposed escalation? I want to remind you that on July 1st, 65, you quoted as saying, "I would listen to George Ball and then reject his theories."
Well, I think George Ball played a very important and honorable role in these discussions. My own view of his general position, I'm not able to comment precisely on a specific memorandum, was that he was much more impressive in arguing the difficulties of any form of increased commitment than he was in arguing that an acceptable course of action was available without such commitment. He's not alone in this difficulty. Opponents of Johnson's policy on the war, all the way through from 65 onward, were naturally called on to explain what kind of satisfactory result in South Vietnam they thought could be obtained by other policies. Some would want to escalate, and others, like Ball, would want to do less and to try to get the best available compromise by negotiation. The notion that a compromise that President Johnson could or would have accepted was available in 1965 always seemed to me really quite unpersuasive.
At the end of 1965, we had stopped the North Vietnamese communist attempt to cut the country in half. Did you feel at the time that that was the moment to stop escalating troop commitment and begin Vietnamization?
Well, I felt that what later came to be called Vietnamization, namely the acceptance and execution of an increasingly responsible and effective role in the defense of South Vietnam by the South Vietnamese, was absolutely essential to any kind of successful outcome right from the beginning. Way back in 1963, President Kennedy had made that point very sharply during the crisis over Diem and New, and I agreed with him. And I did not feel that American troops could change that basic requirement, and I hoped very much that we would maintain our emphasis on the importance of the role of the South Vietnamese. Indeed, made a trip to Saigon with that purpose as central to the trip after the Honolulu meeting in early 1966. I cannot say that I think in the end the whole set of forces that governed our choices and decisions worked that way through 66 and 67. Just to take one example, and without intending to blame any one group more than another, I think it was unfortunate but understandable that as American forces became more and more heavily involved, it became the natural thing for able and ambitious younger officers to prefer an American command to an advisory role with the Vietnamese. And yet, in fact, I think the importance of those advisory roles was very great indeed.
Did you think then it was a mistake to have gone above 200,000 American troops?
I don't know that I can pick a particular number, or that the question really was one that I had any important role in those last months of 65 and early 66, because by that time my own relation with the president really had changed quite a lot. I was not directly involved in that. It was known that I was leaving the government, and I can't really say much about those decisions, except that such role as I did have was in the area of trying to strengthen the part of the whole effort that was not the directly American military effort.
Let me just ask you a couple of larger questions. As we became more and more involved in Vietnam, and I'm asking you to take yourself back to those days of Kennedy and later Johnson, particularly Johnson administration, who was perceived to be the enemy, the aggressor? Was it Hanoi? Was it China? Was it international communism? And if it was the last, was Vietnam the place to make the stand?
When you asked the question, who was the enemy in 63, 64, 65 in the eyes of members of the administration, I think the shape of the precise answer that you get depends a little bit on who you talk to. My view was that this was centrally a contest for the future of Vietnam and Indochina, that it was not a matter of choosing this place to stand against either a southern Peking sponsored expansion or a movement by international communism more broadly. International communism as a unity was no longer a fact of life in the mid-60s. I thought that we had a level of engagement and responsibility for what happened to the government and people of South Vietnam, with whom we had been associated for 10 years, that made it improper to give up, which a failure to reinforce would have implied, I think, in 65, and that we had that much of an obligation to support them and give them a further chance to survive. But I thought of that as important primarily in the context of that area and that region, rather than the context of the worldwide scene, except insofar as a failure to keep a measure of faith with them would have repercussions in other areas.
Let me get into just a couple of personal points.
Quick, minute left.
As a Kennedy appointee, did you feel any discomfort in the Johnson administration?
I felt no discomfort in the Johnson administration because I had been in the Kennedy administration. The president went way out of his way, I think in a quite genuine way, to try to make it clear that people who had worked in the Kennedy administration were welcome and indeed, at least at the beginning, needed in his administration. As time went on, I became, at least for a period, very close to President Johnson. I gradually learned to understand him. He's, of course, a very different man. On the specific question of how the war was defended and explained in 1965, we had a difference. He was aware of it. He was quite critical of my view, and our relations for a while cooled off a bit. But we got to be good friends again later. He called me back into the government on another issue in 67, the Six-Day War.
Sorry. Could you tell us speak about Lyndon Johnson as a person, as a man?
He was a very large man in every way. Big, energetic. And when he focused on a subject, he would focus on it with an intensity that I don't think I've ever seen exceeded by anyone. And, of course, capable of very graphic descriptions. I can give you one that bears to a difference that I had with him over this question of how important it was to emphasize the difficulty and the length and the trial that would be involved in Vietnam, even at best. And he listened to me one day, and he finally said, I think I understand your position, young man. Your opinion is that if your mother-in-law has only one eye and it's in the middle of her forehead, you want her in the living room all the time. By which he meant that emphasizing the pain was not the best way to carry public support.
Do you think that, given his background, Texas, did you sense any suspicion of his, did he have any suspicion towards what he might have considered to be the Eastern establishment? Did you sense any of that?
When he got angry at anybody.
He has a big truck, so just great.
Lyndon Johnson had both a very strong sense of the different regions of the country and a capacity to look at them in both favorable and unfavorable ways. When he was in a good mood about people from New England, he was full of how we were all one country together. But I remember one time when he wanted to get a hold of a variety of people on a summer weekend, and he discovered that McNamara was up in Martha's Vineyard, and Wiesner was up in Martha's Vineyard, and Katzenbach was in Martha's Vineyard. He called me up and said, would you kindly explain, you come from New England, why it is that when I've got a lot of serious problems, my whole goddamn government is lost in the fog on some female island?
What do you think about, how would you describe Lyndon Johnson's concerns about foreign policy? Was it a subject that he was comfortable with, or did he see it largely in terms of domestic politics?
Lyndon Johnson hadn't spent his life... Sir? Yeah, sure. President Johnson had not spent his life on problems of international diplomacy, obviously, but he had a long experience of the larger international issues of the period after World War II. He had been closely associated with congressional action of all sorts through the Eisenhower years as majority leader, and as vice president. While he wasn't closely engaged in the day-to-day business, he was pretty fully informed. He had a certain, perhaps at the beginning at least, lack of assurance about the diplomatic process as such, but he did not have any doubt of his own capacity to grasp basic issues. And he showed, I think, very considerable understanding of the main forces working on other political leaders, because those are questions of politics, and politics was his life, so that he understood a de Gaulle, a Khrushchev. I think the sticking problem on Vietnam was that, at least in his time as president, no political resolution ever came in sight that he could accept.
If you could make a comparison between, since you spanned two administrations, between Kennedy and Johnson, do you think that Johnson, being a Texan, being a Westerner in a sense, was more focused on Asia compared to Kennedy, who might have been more focused on Europe and the Atlantic Alliance? Is that a fair?
It's a fair question. I don't think so. So my answer won't help you very much.
Any other funny stories?
I've got some, but they have to do with Richard Nixon.
I would tell you you're not allowed to.
Okay, go.
Could you describe the Wiseman meeting in March and March of '68, and what went on and what the final recommendations were to the president? And who were they?
The president was considering, well, let's take a minute, turn things off, and let's get the names and numbers of the players in our head. So sometime in March, 1968, the President, I dare say on the advice of Clark Clifford, called in a bunch of people who'd been in earlier administrations, collection of overage destroyers with been there before, one problem or another, and put the situation in front of them, first in a series of briefings by other officials, and then in a discussion in which cabinet officers were present, and then in a discussion of just the so-called wise man and the President. The question that was presented was, in the first instance, should there be a major reinforcement of the ground forces and related forces in Vietnam? And second, should there be some modification of the policy of bombing North Vietnam? I remember what happened because as it happened, the rest of the brethren asked me to be a kind of a rapporteur. I'd been that kind of person in NSC meetings earlier. I was more or less at the center of gravity of the group. And our recommendation, on the whole, not without disagreement, was that there should not be an increase in force levels in South Vietnam, and that there should be a modification of the policy of bombing North Vietnam.
What?
I think we had reached the conclusion that additional troops, American troops on the scene, were not what was needed in South Vietnam and would be even more divisive than what had gone before in the United States, and that it would be wise, by limitation of the bombing in the north, to test the readiness of Hanoi for negotiations.
Do you recall the President's reaction to your report?
The President was not delighted by what we had to say. I think he felt that we had received an unnecessarily gloomy picture of the situation. And it's quite possible, in the light of what we now know about the whole process of reporting on Tet, that he wasn't all wrong. On the other hand, I think he had himself decided, really, that he would not do the ground force reinforcement. So it was more our gloominess, in a way, than our specific recommendations that he may have found troubling.
You don't recall his ever using the phrase to you like somebody's poisoned the well? Or...
I've seen that in the papers, but he didn't say it to us.